There we go. The a vision in my, and people define vision differently. In my mind, the way I use the word vision is I basically see that as what will this community or this church look like if we do our mission really well. So for me, vision is what is it that we imagine seeing in the future if we do our mission really well. Now, like I say, I've heard people do different definitions of vision and mission. They sometimes people switch them, back and forth. But that's the way I use the word, is to talk about where will we see this if we're moving in that direction, if our congregation is moving in that way. So again, where will we see stewardship show up? Well, it wouldn't just be in an annual campaign, though annual campaigns are fine. And they're maybe an important part of the life of the church to give people the opportunity to focus on the future year coming up and how they're going to give. But we'd see it in our worship. We'd see it in the stories that we tell. We would see it in how we live out our mission and how we utilize, how stewardship becomes part of our consciousness when we talk about what mission project we're going to get into. Are we being faithful? Is this where God would have us use our resources? And in areas like in our compassion and advocacy, how are we speaking out to our community and justice? That's, being responsible for the gifts that we've been given. Care of the earth, I mentioned, about how are we living faithfully in terms of taking care of the blessings of the environment that God has given us, and as well in our giving and also in our spending, in the part that we keep as well. So that would be part of the vision as well. This is something that I've found is really a fascinating idea, and it kind of, to me, it speaks to this point, which is, and it comes from a book by Lovett Weems and Anne Michelle, Generosity, Stewardship, and Abundance. And so early on in the book, they take on this idea that really has been kind of the model, I think, in our mindset at church for quite a while, which is that stewardship's purpose is to keep the church going. And what Lovett, and you have this on your handout, so you can read his actual wording of it because I think it's so brilliant. What Lovett and Anne have suggested is the possibility that the church might exist to teach faithful stewardship. That's really, that we've kind of put it as sort of a fundraising function of keeping the church open. But really, what if in our mindset we looked at this and saying, well, one of the reasons for a healthy church is that we continue to teach people about being faithful stewards. And if you think about it, if you think about all of the different situations that happen in our world that divide us and pull us apart, many of them have to do with resources, about what Jesus taught us about how we have resources, how we use them, how we share them, and all those kind of things. And so, maybe it's just a neat way to look at that, to say it's about more than just raising the money we need to keep the doors open. But if we looked at it from the other side and said, the church's important role, is that we might have a world where people recognize the importance of stewardship and being faithful and sharing what they have, and that it's not about who has more or that people amass these great quantities, but it's about how do we live in kind of faithful way to that. So that's just an idea to think about. And like I said, I think it's fun to do that kind of a mind shift and say, what if we looked at it at this way? It's not just being this little thing we have to do for a month in the fall, and that it keeps the church open in the coming year. What if we moved it up in its place, saying this is an important part of who we are and what we teach? So I'd like you to take a minute and find, you can do groups of two, do it in groups of three if that's more comfortable. And here's the question I want to focus. I gave you a long list of places where stewardship might show up in churches. And that was a really long, extensive list. But where does stewardship show up in your church right now? And then each time I give you one of these questions, I'll put a couple little secondary kind of questions in there that might help you kind of get your discussion going around that area. But just take a couple of minutes, and I'm going to kind of set a timer on my watch. Where does stewardship show up in your church now? And those of you who are at home, you can just ponder that question, I guess. I don't know that we can put you into groups or not at this point, but just give some thought to that, and we'll have some time to give feedback. 30 seconds or so. All right, if we can sort of wrap it up, finish talking. We're getting really good responses from the folks who are on Zoom, and they're putting it into chat. So we thank them for those, and we're capturing those. So that's great to see as well. Again, here we go. I have to close the chat. Messing things up. Give me a break. Trying to get up here and close up the chat that I was looking at. Go back to the slide we want to be at. There we go. Second movement that we want to talk about is a movement, and this may be places your churches may be in good places with this, maybe it's places where you can strengthen. But one of the movements is really identifying the importance of a church being a church for a community. One of the things I've noticed is I've traveled around. I do go to annual conferences every year as part of my work. We all of us at Discipleship Ministries, most of us are assigned to go. We try to go to every annual conference, have a presence at every annual conference. One of the things I've noticed at annual conferences is if I'm present and around in the room when they do the appointments, when they appoint clergy to their, more and more what I'm hearing bishops say is, I'm appointing you to this community, not to this church. And with the understanding of that, every United Methodist Church is a mission outpost to that community, and the importance of that. And again, we emphasize at discipleship the idea of go and make disciples. It's not wait in the church and make disciples, but go and make disciples. And Martin was very generous in saying that I was involved with Open Hearts, Open Minds, Open Doors. That was the first part of the campaign of Igniting Ministry, was that particular theme for us as United Methodists. And what we discovered in the Igniting Ministry phase, which I think started around 2000, was that we trained people to be welcoming when new people came to their church. That was the main thrust of it. But after about 8 years, what we realized was that we were kind of encouraging people to wait in the church for people to come. And so we came up with the idea for Rethink Church, which was really to get people outside the church and engaging with their communities, and to have that as being the opportunity, a bridge that might bring people into seeing what the mission of the church was and their presence in that community. And so I think more and more what I'm hearing from folks is that what is bringing growth, what is bringing new people in, is becoming that church in that community and getting out and finding the ways that they can work together with folks. And again, we were meeting 2 days ago up in Reno, and folks began to share with us, ways that they're finding to kind of build bridges into their community. Looking for what are some of the things that the community has in needs, and how can we work with others in the community. And it's not just, not we're only going to work with the, Christian churches, but we're willing to come into the community and work where there are problems that are going to make people's lives better. I think it's important for us in the church and for bringing people in, and for people to see that this is a worthwhile community to be a part of, to grow in, is if we make that vision visible, if we tell people, continue to tell people about, we are a church here that looks beyond our walls, and to see how we can help and how we can reach out to people and share the love and compassion of Jesus Christ. And so also I mentioned too that the important part of that is it's not just sitting in the church and deciding what the community needs, but getting out in the community to do that. My favorite story about that is the church that decided that they weren't going to have a contemporary early service or whatever, or a Saturday night service. And they'd gone through all these discussions, and they said, well, we did a poll and we decided that there really wasn't a need for it. And they said, and so the question I think I asked them, I said, well, when did you do the poll? And they said, well, we just passed it out at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. And I said, well, okay, so then you really had the audience there already. It's kind of a slant there, whatever. But the idea is, how do we find ways to listen to other people and to begin to hear where are the places that are hurting? Where are the pains in our community? And how can we not just take them on ourselves, but how can we help and participate with others to do that and to move on? I've used for years this expression, which kind of dates me, but it's the old American Express used to have this series of commercials saying membership has its privileges, and it was all about, if you got an American Express card, you were, kind of in a more elite category. And it always stuck with me, because when I started out in ministry, all we talked about was membership. We said, how many members do you have? It's the first question you had when you ask another pastor, how many members in your church? And it seemed at that time that membership was like the finish line. Somebody came to your church, they visited twice, you invited them to join. You may or may not have had a class for new members. A lot of churches didn't. And if they joined, that was it. They were on the list, and that was the end of it. At Discipleship Ministries, we really, under the leadership of Junius Dotson, who was our general secretary back a few years, Junius really said, what we need to be focusing on is our churches having intentional discipleship systems. Do we have ways to move people from membership so that they continue to grow in their discipleship? Or do we simply say coming in and saying yes and to the membership vows is going to be enough for them? So again, what I say now is the folks are saying it's not about membership, it's about discipleship. And membership has that kind of connotation sometimes that you're part of the club. I think discipleship has the fact that you've gotten some sending orders. You've been giving a mission. Your mission is to go into, and to do that. So we are, a church that's mission is to make disciples who make disciples who make disciples, really is where we want to be with that. Again, looking for those kind of stories of where we can kind of show that mission off and contact with that community are the healthy things that people are looking for in terms of their financial support. And we're going to talk more about that, but people really are looking for not so much to say, I'm going to give because the budget needs it, but they're really looking to say, I want to be somewhere where my giving makes an impact. And again, I put this line at the bottom. I had a friend at seminary who went for his interview. The DS was going to bring him into it on a particular appointment. And so we were all excited the next day to find out how things went with his interview with the church PPR committee. And his line when he came back is he said, I went into seminary to become a fisher of men, but they want a quick keeper of the aquarium. and that's what happens when we fall into that club mentality. It's like, you got to keep all the people here happy. That's your main job kind of a thing. So anyway, it's just a fun way to kind of focus on that, not to pick on the church, but it's, the image that we want to kind of avoid getting into. This is just kind of a little aside, but I think it's helpful to see is I get the Giving USA reports, which report on all charitable giving, all the charitable giving that goes on in the US. And if you've ever seen these or heard the reports of this, the amount of the giving goes up, but the amount of giving to religion has consistently decreased over the years. And one of the indicators is, I should say that religion is still the largest segment of that, but it has shrunken away. And I found this particular connection, and I thought it was pretty interesting, was that over the 20 years, and I think this particular report that I cited was 2023 or something, but over a period of the past 20 years, giving to religion, even though it was still the largest slice, was almost exactly in half of what it was over 20 years. So it had gone from 54% to 27%. In that same period, and this is again, giving to all charitable causes, nonprofits, all that stuff that goes on, the giving to human services was the second largest slice of that pie, and it had actually doubled in that same period. It had been 7% of the slice, and then it was 14%. And so I said to say, okay, well, let me get a clearer picture of what human services are. And this is the way that they defined what human services were: feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, caring for the elderly, and nurturing the young. And I said, well, United Methodist, this is our area. What happened? How are we, but, and again, I don't know that it's, that more and more, we know that more and more nonprofits are created all the time and people are giving and contributing to that. But it's a consciousness that we need to kind of do as we emphasize with our churches about, how do we get out? How do we reach beyond our borders? I do a narrative budget online course, and I ask people the question, do you have any children in your church? It's like the second question I ask them, I think. And people will answer in the course, no, we don't have any children. And then I'll go on and about two more questions after they've done two more sessions. I'll ask the question, what's an outreach program in your church that people are really proud of? And the same people will say to me, well, we have an after school program that has 35 children who come and get help with their homework. And I'll say, well, wait a minute. You told me you didn't have any children in your church. And I'll say, didn't ask you if you had children in worship. I didn't ask you if you had children in said, you have, and that's a story that you want to tell. That's a ministry that your church opens the doors for and gives space to. Maybe you don't, maybe you don't run the program. Maybe you don't get income from the program, but that's your church and mission. And so again, it's kind of where our mindset is in terms of what we're reaching out and what we're doing. And again, I challenge folks with that. I said, just because they haven't come back and brought parents, or just because they haven't started, contributing on a regular basis or whatever, doesn't mean that your church is not touching those lives in the community. So again, work with your congregational connections. That would be my vision. We're saying, when we engage with the community, we are out in the community, but we're also working with the connections we have in the church. The person in our church who also happens to work, volunteer as a soccer coach, or a person in the community who serves on one of the town committees for welfare, or somebody who's connected with a feeding program we could support, or our church could connect with. And again, oftentimes we're going to talk about this later, about buildings and our assets in terms of facilities and property, but the church can offer space. Usually we can offer visibility. Oftentimes our churches are in good locations where we can help kind of promote other good things that are going on in the community. Volunteers, we have expertise in the churches. We have folks who are, retired. I'm very close to that now, in a couple of months away. I would love the opportunity to contribute that. And again, it's placed through a local church. You can say, hey, we have some folks who could help you out with that, or could be good folks to work in that kind of setting on that particular issue. And again, it's show people where they're donors, where their giving is making an impact and touching lives. You're going to hear me come back to that more and more. I lift this up just because this is really something that's relatively new for us, but this idea of the bishops and the connectional table developing a vision statement for us in the church. And again, it focuses around forming disciples of Jesus Christ, empowered by the Holy Spirit. And our role is to love boldly, serve joyfully, and lead courageously in local communities and worldwide connections. It's just another emphasis on that point that, we are there in that community to be a mission station for Jesus Christ, and to look outside those doors and outside those walls and see where we can make a difference. So I'll put this question to you and give you a few minutes to do this. What difference does your church make in the community? And if you want to take it from a different direction, it would be, if your church closed tomorrow, what would people notice and or miss because you have your church closing? So again, you don't have to go to the same group. You can find other people, or you can go back to the group you started with. And I'll just give you about 5 minutes or so to talk about this. Make sure everybody gets a little chance to talk. And folks on the Zoom, go ahead and you put your comments in. That'll be great. And we'll give a little time to have some discussion around this.
Are we doing breakout groups or?
Can you do that? Just throw them into randomly.
Are we doing breakout groups?
No, we're talking about doing that. We didn't get that plan kind of into our thing, but we have somebody tech savvy enough to put you into some breakout rooms.
So we just do like the Brady Bunch.
When you get the breakout rooms, introduce yourselves real quick and tackle the question. We'll give you a few extra minutes.
Excuse me, how many people do you want to have in each breakout room?
Risha, I just wrote back to you. Can we do a group of 5, please?
Okay, thank you. Hi everyone, you should receive a notification to join the breakout room.
I can respond to something. We're going to bring you back out of your breakout rooms for our online folks. Looks like, well, you had some good sized groups. Heavens, that's wonderful. I hadn't seen a list. We're going to bring you back, and if you have some feedback, if you're in a breakout group and you have something feedback to share, we'll really be looking for kind of aha moments or something new that you heard that sparked something. I'm not looking for long narratives, but just kind of an idea that maybe came out of your discussion. And so I'll ask the folks here as our online folks are coming out of their breakout rooms. So any here for the groups in here, any aha moments, any insights that were shared and the people you talked with that were kind of new thoughts for you? Yes. Oh, okay. I love that. Yeah, we're all stuck in the same place, so we're all trying to get out of where we are. But yeah, okay, well, that's great. I appreciate that insight. Uh, all right. Anything else in here? Yes, go ahead. Bring this over here for you real quick. I'll do the Phil Donahue if you're okay.
Sorry. The thing that we had in common was that we were all rural or formerly rural churches that are now in the midst of things and with a hesitancy to reach out to the new folks and the new developments.
Great insight. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Anything from the online groups coming up?
Repeat one more time because they just came back from the breakout.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So folks in the online groups now, we've got a little bit of sharing in here, and I tried to run with the microphone, but what I'm really looking for is like those moments of new insight. One of the ones that was shared here is that we had nothing new, but we all had the same old, we were staying in the same old situation, kind of in a, shared that mutual place where we haven't kind of moved out of. And I think that was good. And again, the other conversation I ran the microphone over was about, being in rural places now that are being more developed, and how do you integrate people who are new to the community to people who have long history in the community? And yeah, my wife and I are, my poor church that we attend, I keep using it as examples, but it's a community of a lot of people who've been in that church for generations. And then when we come in as new, they're friendly to us, but it's very hard to get over that barrier of the fact that we are not long-term townspeople, kind of a thing. So yeah, I completely understand that. So if you're in a breakout group and you have something you want to just, put shortly an insight that came out of your breakout group, put that in the chat. We're going to take a couple of minutes for that. Yeah, let me come over here.
So from the chat from Michael and Jennifer, it says, for consideration of our team, re-look at our committees to actively include volunteers that do not belong to the church but assist with our ministries. They know their communities, they're affected by, and provide meaningful insights to the needs that need to be met. Meeting those needs bring connections. And Reverend Ann also shared that we just can't fill a need. We need to hear the people.
Okay, so I'm gonna move us on, try and keep us on schedule, because if I don't, we'll be rushing through the last three of these as we move along. This one I am not going to spend a whole lot because I don't have a whole lot of stories on it. But as I did some reflection about where we are and what things we're moving is this idea of being trustworthy and in how we deal with stewardship and our finances became one that I think became really important for me. I was invited by my own conference. I'm a member, an elder in the Greater New Jersey Annual Conference. And the conference had decided that they have made sexual ethics training mandatory for all clergy in the conference. A lot of conferences have that. They decided that they also needed to have financial ethics training. And so as an area that was pretty new to me, but I said I would, could I prepare some kind of a course that all their clergy could take? And I wrote a course on financial ethics for pastoral leaders. And it was required of not just elders and deacons, but of local pastors and also certified lay ministers. I've been required to take it. And it's an eye-opening experience for me. And because of that, I think we had a lot of conversations and a lot of sharing, not just about financial misconduct, but about the breaking of trust and about things like, not being completely transparent with what was going on in the church's finances. And so I'm going to touch on this because I really do think it's an important, and I think that we live in a time where we can't necessarily assume that the church as an institution is trusted, and the expectations there are that we are completely transparent. We've lived through a time of a lot of things that have happened. the Boy Scout suit lawsuit was one in particular. You know, we've all kinds of inappropriate things that happen in churches, and they may be outside of our denomination. The Boy Scout situation wasn't. We were one of the largest supporters of Boy Scout troops, and so that was a challenge for us as United Methodists. But you know, when something happens in any kind of church or some kind of misappropriation, the reflection oftentimes is back on churches in general. And so transparency, I think, is one of those things that we can make happen in local church settings. And we can't necessarily assume that when people come to our church, they trust us with the money and the donations they have. We have to earn that. And like I said here, I think, you know, our failures are what oftentimes get much more attention. So my main thinking in this, and I'm not going to take too long to kind of share this with you, is in the nonprofit sector, this is almost universally the things that people are told. And that is that the three most important factors for donors who give to any kind of charitable cause is belief in the mission, the faith in the leadership, and financial transparency. And so, you know, belief in our mission, if people understand what we're about and we are living up our mission and what we say, what we verbalize as our mission, that's what people will again focus on. Are we focused on going out and outreaching to people, or are we focused more on taking care and keeping people happy there? How well do we buy into that? Faith in our leadership, you know, in this case, in local churches, our pastors and our lay leadership and the people who are in charge of our church, do we believe in their sincerity and the work that they're doing? And then financial transparency. Are we letting people see things? Yes.
A financial or a transparency situation. I'm new to this church in July, and we have folks who only want to donate to the kids, right? So they're going to donate to that. We've got like 3,500 stacked up in a savings, you know, that's kid tagged. And we spent about $600 last year on all our curriculum and the whole bit. And we're not making our other bills. And so bringing that transparency piece about is letting folks know, yeah, we're good. Yeah, we believe in the kids. We're going to fund the kids. And realistically, we have an ancient building and we've got to take care of the dry rot, you know. So the transparency will also help understanding that, yes, we are, our values are your values, and we have these other things.
This is, in my role, I hear hearing this more and more. And this is what shapes some of these things that I do, is when I have these conversations with people and we're saying, and we're going to talk about, I think this connects to the fact, we're going to talk about people's giving tied to seeing impact, places where they see impact happening. And that's a wonderful thing. I think that's important. That's why I talk about narrative budgets and those kind of things. Where it comes into danger is when people do that designating of their giving. And I've had people who say, you know, I want to give half of my tithe to the youth program, or I want to give half of, you know, I love what the work that the food pantry is doing. You know, they told us they served 2,000 customers last year. So I'm just going to take half of my money. I'm going to give it right to the food pantry. Well, that's easy to say in our hearts, but the reality is we need to have that conversation back to people to say, you know, we can't continue to do the food pantry if we don't have the income to pay the insurance, to pay the electricity bill, to have the refrigerators or freezers or whatever might be the situation there. So people need to understand that. And oftentimes what people will say to me is they'll say, you know, well, we have our budget or our operations budget or whatever, and people don't want to give to it. And I said, don't call it your operations budget. That's your mission budget. That's your ministry budget. And, you know, you need to begin to communicate that to people, that these things are not going to happen unless we are able to fund the mission and ministry. You know, the food pantry happens and they have volunteers in the food pantry, but those volunteers are, you know, guided by people who are on the church staff. They're utilizing resources from the church and space from the church that are all part of that. So that's a real concern. You know, in the transparency issue is where I have people who have that situation of saying, well, you know, we have all these building problems. but the trustees have some money put away that nobody really knows how much is there. And, they're kind of gonna, they're going to come in at the last minute and save the day because they have some funds that they haven't told us about, kind of a thing. That to me is the dramatic end of that. And that's the thing that kind of, or there was a bequest given, and we know there was a bequest given, but we don't know how much is in that fund, and nobody is reporting on it because it's been kind of snuck away. But the situation that you were talking about, Kathy, is that right? Am I seeing your tag? My vision is great. That's one I'm dealing with, I would say, on a weekly basis. Is somebody saying, we have people who just want to give to a very visible part of our mission and take it away from our ministry budget. And that's a real challenge because, designated giving says you have to do that in that case. One of the things that we can do, and I don't think I really talk about it here, but you can set up gift acceptance policies in your church that will help you say, these are how we receive gifts. And, a lot of times this comes up in terms of memorial giving, where people will have given money for a memorial and they say, we want this to be for choir robes because my mother sang in the choir. And I said, well, yeah, when your mother sang, we did wear choir robes. We don't wear choir robes anymore. And, it's just like, how do you handle that with a family, or how do you say no to somebody when they want? I had a guy who came to my church, first church I served, and he had been raised Catholic and his wife had passed away. And he wanted to donate $10,000 to the church for us to put up a statue of Mary, and I said, well, we love Mary in the United Methodist Church, but, kind of a thing. And I said to him, let's sit down and have a talk about some things we might do that. Because I said, our church doesn't have a place. We're not kind of statue people and we don't really have a place for that, but let's find something we can do. And that kind of carries over to some of this too, is that people want to give that money and focus it. So that's one of the opportunities. We can get some guidance in place in terms of gifts, how we accept gifts. And that takes the person, is with the pastor or the trustee person, it takes you off the hook because you go back to the policy and I say, I'm not saying no to this. This is the policy that the church adopted. And we have a whole I have on the website, I think I have a whole long list of about 10 policies that churches ought to have in that kind of nature that the board has approved, and that takes individuals off the hook of saying yes or no to people, but saying, well, we have a policy and here's what the policy says about outside groups using space in the church, what you can do and what you can't do, kind of a thing. Here's what it says about memorial gifts. We'll take a memorial gift if we haven't worked out what it's going to be used for after 6 months. It's going to go into an ongoing endowment or something like that. Those kind of policies. And then when people ask, they want to make a gift, you could just say, yeah, just make sure you take a look at, this is what our gift policy is here at the church. So anyway, so again, it's all about, are people confident that their giving is being supported in that way? One of the things that I kind of stress in the same area of that trust area is reporting on what things are in the church in a clear way. And I experienced this just recently. I'm not on any of the boards of the church where I go to, where I attend, but they invite me every once in a while to come. It's a one board model kind of thing this church is using. They invite me to come every once in a while, and I came to one of their meetings, and they meet after service, 11 o'clock service, and they handed out their financial report, and it was about 18 pages long. Now, this is like, I think some of this comes from QuickBooks or one of these programs, which you can hit a button and it will report for the month, and it'll print out all these pages. And I watched people around the room, and I don't want to look at every check that has been written or whatever. And I looked at people in the room, and they couldn't make heads nor tails of it. A couple of people who had accounting backgrounds could. And I say, again, it's about clarity in your reports. Report clearly what's going on with the church and its finances. That makes a lot of sense to people. Let them see quickly what's happening. Again, invite input, invite people to respond to the report. What something concerns you, tell us, about when you see in the report. And again, we're trying to connect our dollars to ministry and mission. So even using that language is so important to us. I said back when I started out in my ministry, one of my favorite pet peeves, and I hope nobody's doing this in your church because how people you'll feel the light of guilt on you, but the little boxes that we used to put in our newsletters. And what it said was, what people did was they took the budget and they divided it by 52 weeks or whatever. And so then they would add it up and they'd say, this is how much we should have had in our budget. This is how much we received. And this is how far we felt short, and usually a negative number or something like that. And then, it would show at the bottom cumulatively, this is how far behind we are. And my objection to that was twofold. One was, of course, that it doesn't really reflect how money comes into the church, and that most of our churches are going to do our best, our best offerings in the last 6 weeks or 8 weeks of the year. And so for 10 months, it's going to look like we're going down the toilet. But the other part of that is that it really doesn't kind of indicate to people, that good things are happening, that we're in good shape. And if somebody new comes into your church and they look at this box and they think, well, wow, this church probably won't be around by Christmas time because they're going down, they're really, circling the drain kind of a thing. And so what I tell folks is a much healthier way to do that, if you want to report to people in the bulletin and you want to kill those things, is to compare this Sunday to a same Sunday last year, to reflect back. And that requires that you keep, kind of keep these records, but, have somebody kind of with that assignment. And again, you can try to match up, Easter, this is our Easter Sunday. Last week we had Easter Sunday. This was our offering. Last year, this is what our Easter offering was. And then people will get a clearer vision of saying, are we ahead or are we behind? And if you're behind, that may be a cause for some concern and some attention to that, or a follow-up letter or whatever. Sorry you were away, at Easter time. If you still, you'd like to make a special gift or whatever, those kind of things. But you're doing it in a much more transparent way. And so I say here, show the good, the bad, and the not ugly, but not so pretty stuff. Let people know what's going on. If there's, if there are some issues that are coming up, make sure people know that. And again, if you can make it simple and visual for people to see, a one-page report says these are the balances in our funds. This is what we took in. This is what went out. And here's how our cash flow happened, over the course of this month. And you can compare it to the previous month right in those reports as well, and put all of that on one page.
Dr. Ken?
Yes. Question, yes.
Wonderful feedback. I'm not going to read all of them. I hope you guys get a chance, but we do have a question from Siteri. Can you please highlight pastor's role in the handling of church offerings?
Yeah, and the handling of the offerings, you say, or the reports? Okay, yeah. We are basically, if you look at paragraph 340 in the discipline, elders, local pastors, and I would say probably CLMs if they're in that spot, we have a responsibility over that financial role. I've often said, pastors, I go to the finance committee, but nobody really asks me anything. And well, there's about 8 things in that paragraph 340 about our responsibilities that has, and we basically are in the same way that we say our bishops are in charge of the spiritual and the temporal life of the church. Well, if you look at that language, it's given to pastors. We have a responsibility over that life as well. So, we need to be the ones to say, our trustees, you've always worked this way. You don't bring a report to the council meeting, or you bring it, once a year or whatever. I really believe that in my role as pastor, I need to kind of say, our folks need the transparency to know what our finances are. And that's your leadership role. Now, your leadership role in finance may not be picking what accounting software that you're going to use. That may not be your jam, but I think you do have a role of saying, we're not being transparent about this, and we are fooling our people. We got this money and we haven't designated for a specific purpose, but we're still telling people that we're broke and we're poor and we need their giving. And they're not going to trust us if we're not transparent about the fact that, yes, we have received this bequest, but our plan is to invest it with the Cal Nevada Foundation, and we're going to use the interest from that to support new ministries, only new ministries. That's why we need you to continue giving to the budget. That's the transparency, saying, yes, we did receive this, and here's what it means. Is that the main question we want to answer? Okay, great. Along with that, I also talk, and it's not necessarily untransparency, but I think it's so important, is I think it's crucial that we look for our opportunities to say thank you to people. And what comes to my mind first are, when you send statements out from the church, quarterly statements, people get them, it tells reports what their giving is, but oftentimes you open it up and it looks like a bill, and it's a perfect opportunity to put in there a little message, tell people about what their giving did, how it's blessed, people's lives, something impactful the church has done. We did an Easter egg hunt, and we had 300 kids from the community came, and they found Easter eggs and they got cookies, and it was a great celebration. And hey, they knew that this was a church that didn't just care about its members and cared about all the children in the community. And we put a little note about that in next to their giving, and it looks less like a bill and more like a thank you for the giving that you've done. And I tell people all the time, thank people, 2 or 3 times in the course of whatever you write in there. Just remind them, how your faithfulness, and regardless of whether they were the best giver in the church or the small, your faithfulness has made such a difference. And because of your faithfulness, this church has been able to reach out in this way. Again, those stories, praise them. And I also put on the bottom here, because I think it's something we sometimes overlook, is, it's great to talk about, not just about what people have given now or what we want them to give in the future, but to talk about the moments in the life of the church when your faithfulness has really made a difference. And I mentioned Lovett Weems' book. He's kind of one of my heroes and a mentor, for me and stuff. And I heard him at a workshop in West Virginia, and Lovett works at the Lewis Center in Washington, and I've been to his presentations, and sometimes he kind of presents very dry, but he dropped back into his Mississippi preacher status. And he gave us this is how I would invite people to give. And he would go back and he'd say, you people are the most generous people I've never served a congregation full of people who just responded when things were when they had a need. And you remember when we needed to repair that roof, and I tell you, I wasn't sure that we were going to have it, and you just all responded so gracefully, and he was just, it was so perfect. And it was not untrue. He used all those things, but it just showered people with that kind of gratitude. And then he kind of said, and you know what? Right now we're experiencing a challenge, and I'm not worried about it because I remember how great you were when you did this, And he does it with, I can't do the Mississippi accent, but it just makes it even better, But again, it's like sometimes we forget to say, remind people, most churches we're in, we're not what we were. We've been through disaffiliation, we've been through COVID, we've had people who drifted off, we've lost some of our saints and our older people. So in a lot of times I find this is the situation, but it's okay to remind people about, when you pulled together as a congregation back then, whatever, and give them that encouragement that, we've faced tough things before, and, we found ways to move on and to not throw up our hands and say, this is the end of it. So anyway, so those are the things I think are important. Here's our next question. And this one I don't think will take a lot of time, but is it easy to understand how your church's money is used? Is your church communicating that? Is there, are they making that visible to people? And then a side question for that, you can talk about or not, is where does that trust feel strong, or where does it feel fragile? So the main question is one about how good are you at telling your people how your money is used? So again, you can go into your groups. I think you're all pretty much set. You're going to stay in your groups and you're not going to wander off, but that's okay. That's okay. We'll just go ahead and do that. And the folks online, we're going to throw you into some new chat groups kind of randomly, and meet your friends, your digital friends, and do that. Is it easy to understand how your church's money is used? And does the trust feel strong or feel fragile? Either one of those, great. We're going to come back together in about 3 minutes. Many people a chance to talk as possible. All right. So we come back to they're all coming back now? Good. Okay. Oh, okay. Give them a minute or 30 seconds. Whoops. Can't walk in that direction. I'm gonna kill myself. So we're gonna give you a short break in a minute. Before we do that, I wanted to take a minute. I love 45 years I've been in ordained ministry, and I love being part of a connected church in so many reasons. But one of the reasons that I love it is that throughout the course of pastoral ministry, working at an annual conference, working for 2 different agencies, my path continues to cross. That I've been before. I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Are they hearing me? Oh, okay. Thank you. So quite a few years ago, I was asked to be on the staff of the Greater New Jersey Annual Conference. And in the course of my traveling, I met to a young person who had was serving in West Ohio. Is that correct? The West Ohio Conference as a communications intern from United Methodist Communications. There was a program there which would provide communications folks who are coming out of school with the opportunity to work in an annual conference side by side with the communicator for the conference. And I happened to walk into a meeting in West Ohio somewhere, and I was introduced to David Malloy. And at the time, New Jersey didn't have a communications person. And I said, what are you going to do after you finish this internship? And he didn't know what it was. And so I said, any possibility you'd be willing to come to New Jersey? And he kind of gave me permission to talk to our bishop about it. It became the communications person at the conference during my tenure there. And then went to work for the Board of Global Ministries. And then when the Board of Global Ministries was picking up and moving to Atlanta, went to do something else. And now here he is in Cal, Nevada. And all of this journey and my barnstorming tour around Cal, Nevada is with the great support of the Cal Nevada Fund. Could you come up and just say a word for folks? And Mark.
Let me say one thing. I want you, all of you, including Zoom, join me in thanking David. So this event is sponsored by a UN Foundation so that we can travel around and we can have a place to stay. So, and also paying his travel expenses as well. And I want to say thank you for partnership, and please give us a little your word of encouragement. At the same time, Bishop Sandy Allwine always asks me, so Martins, what will be next? Which means after this training, we are going to have a cohort. If you're interested, David is willing to help us out. Any congregation interested to continue learning and supporting each other and learning laboratory, then he's willing to help us out. So please join me and thank him, David.
Thank you. It sounds like I'm paying for my old boss to come out here to visit me in California, but it's definitely a worthy endeavor, and I've known Ken for over 20 years now, and so he plucked me out of obscurity and placed me in a position at the Greater New Jersey Annual Conference where they were going through at the time some transition. They had just merged their two conferences, and so to be a part of a conference staff where we were addressing some of those concerns and things like that was interesting. And we also had Episcopal change and some other things that were taking place. So we've been in the trenches together for quite some time. And in my travels and being a part of the denomination in a professional way and being able to see Ken's growth and journey and him being able to see mine has just been heartwarming. And he says he's retiring in a couple months. I'll believe it when I see it. So with his knowledge and expertise are always valuable to the denomination and to the church. And I'm sure there'll be some way for people in the denomination to figure out how to continue to tap into that. I definitely will be calling on him to, give me words of wisdom and knowledge as he's been able to do for the last several decades. And so it's a joy and pleasure to have him here and to get to share his knowledge with the annual conference that I'm serving right now is a real pleasure.
When David came to work at the conference, he was the youngest person in the building, and everybody was trying. Everybody knew somebody they wanted to set him up with, whatever. But I'm glad his life has settled down, and he's got beautiful wife and beautiful children now, and we don't have to worry about him anymore. He's I have to worry about some of the children I actually biologically attached to, but I don't have to worry about this one anymore. So anyway, all right. So we're gonna maybe we take a little break if you need to. Anybody need to take a little stand up bio break or whatever? Do about 10 minutes, and bathrooms are, where the direct people to restrooms. And oh, okay. Okay. And then we're going to move on to section 4 and going to pick it up a little bit. Folks, online, stretch, get up, stretch, get out of your chair, get a beverage if you want. We're going to do about 10 minutes. In fact, I'm going to set the timer right now. All right, folks online, get settled back in.
About news. Downtown. Tell us about this story.
Yeah. So this has nothing to do with the presentation, but everybody in Nashville is buzzing about this. The fact that Elon Musk has approached Nashville. Nashville doesn't have very good. We don't have any kind of public transportation system besides the buses that run in town. We have no train. We had a beautiful train station downtown, but passenger trains don't go through there anymore. But Elon came up with this plan to make a tunnel from the airport to downtown Nashville, somewhere near our convention center. And nobody quite knows exactly how this is going to happen, whether they're going to go so deep, because it goes under buildings that are existing and all kinds of things on this path. And once the tunnel is completed, it's not going to be for you to drive your car, and it's going to be for self-driving vehicles only that are going to run back and forth in these tunnels. And it's just, to the credit of Elon and all the engineers at his place that are working on this, it's so far in the future. It's really hard for us to kind of, people not to talk about it and kind of laugh, like saying, oh yeah, right, they're gonna drill a tunnel or whatever. But they obviously, these engineers know the technology or whatever, are going to do it. So it could be amazing when it actually happens, but we'll see how many people are willing to get into a car without a driver and go through the tunnel and go back and forth with town, because we really don't have any good way for people who come in for meetings in a big, beautiful convention center in downtown. And of course, wonderful music everywhere. The big selling point for Nashville is that, you can go to just about any restaurant, you'll hear live music. In the airport, the places that sell, barbecue sandwiches have somebody playing. I mean, there's no shortage of people trying to break into the music business. And so we have wonderful music and entertainment, but it'll be interesting to see if it actually happens. So, so in that spirit of kind of looking towards, where we are and futuring things, I did want to talk about the movement about moving to the reality of our digital reality of what we have moved into in the church. And as I came into this job in 2011, my thing that I wanted to champion more, I think, than anything else, was to kind of be the one who ran around from church to church saying, digital giving is coming. Digital giving is coming. Checks are going away, and electronic giving is what's going to keep us going in the future. And the thought of one day waking up and they're not doing checks anymore, was kind of a scary kind of thought as I thought about churches. But what I found when I started sharing that was a lot of people's resistance to that kind of a change, and that that's not going to happen here. That's not going to happen here. The other resistance that I would get in church after church was that we're not going to pay those fees. That's money they're taking right away from the church. We're not going to pay those fees. And so I went through these discussions with folks, and of course, after the pandemic hit, it was a lot easier to kind of get this point across to resistance, because I say, when all of a sudden in March of 2020, and we were looking at the prospect of churches not being able to open their doors for worship, people who had already set up electronic giving were in a lot better position than people who hadn't even looked at it yet. And so, so I kind of felt like at least it changed the level in terms of how we had to sell it to people. But the epiphany I have, and some of you, I don't know if you've been in ministry this long, but when I started out in ministry, we bought offering envelopes, these little books of offering envelopes for folks. And I had probably, I think in the first church I served, I probably had about 110, 120 families, that were, that we had buy the offering envelopes for. But, if you bought a little more, you got a discount on them. So really it didn't cost you more to go from, to 200 or whatever. And so I would buy these envelopes. I would put labels on them. I put them in the back of the church, assign people their numbers, blah, blah, blah. Some people would pick them up, and the ones they didn't pick up, I would take over to the post office and I would pay, I know it was over $1. I want to say maybe like $1.10 to mail each one of these booklets to people's homes. Once I mailed them to their homes, I had no guarantee that anybody was going to even use them or that they didn't just throw them away. But the reality was that in that little church that I served, and not little, it's good size, church, I have full-time appointment. In that church that I served, nobody ever questioned about the cost of those offering envelopes, and nobody ever questioned about, the cost of shipping them to people to get them into their homes. And I say the difference with electronic giving, friends, is you only pay when people give money to your church. You don't pay those fees just, you pay, this 3% or whatever it is when people give to the church. And so, so yes, if someone makes $100 contribution to your church, yes, it's going to cost you $3. You're only going to get $97. And, I have people saying, well, how do we count that $3 that we lose? Well, you just put it under your, expenses. That's the cost of doing the business in this. But the reality is we're in a situation now where people can give on a regular basis like that. I still say that the automatic recurring giving is about the best thing that could happen to your church. If you can get people to buy into that, that's that is kind of the gold standard of that, because if people have to go away, I have to travel this weekend, I don't have to worry about whether or not, I'm going to catch up, or I might miss annual conference season. I'll miss 3 or 4 Sundays in a row. I don't have to worry now about how much do I have to put in the envelope, because on every Friday when I get paid, my tithe comes out and my check, my transfer to the church happens on that same day. And it's just that kind of power. And so, again, I think, like I say, what we need to look at when we look at this digitally is, things are different. If you have children like I do, they may never have written a check, and they wouldn't know what to do with writing a check. If they opened a checking account, they're not sure why the word checking was in there, because they got it at an ATM card, and that's really all they need. They can use it at the gas station. They can use it when they go out to eat or whatever. So the world has changed in that. And if we just kind of stay settled in it and saying we're not going to venture into that, we're basically closing the doors on people. We'll also explore about this too, about, how do we eliminate barriers to people for making this transition? We often say, well, the technology is too hard, or it's too complicated, or in a time when there are scams and scandals, people don't want to give their information up or whatever. And so one of the things I think we have to address, because the reality is checks are not going to be here forever. I have a report from the Federal Reserve that I used to quote to people and things, and they said they expected the checks would go away by 2026. And I said, well, okay, so they didn't call that one just exactly right, but it kind of indicates that we're getting close. And, like I say, Social Security made the move to say they weren't going to mail checks out. Now it's all going to be digital into accounts and those kind of things. So anyway, so that's the reality we have to live with. The second part of this movement that I really want to connect with this is what digital culture has done for how people will find our church. And again, I'll use a personal example. My last church that I served was a new church plant. And this is back in 1989. And back then, about the money that I could spend on marketing and advertising the church, the best place to spend it was getting a ad in the yellow pages, right? I mean, that tells you how old I am now. That was, and that was a big expense. That was costing the church, $300-400 a year. But we're living in an environment now where we have all these different venues of ways in which we can let people know who we are as a church. And we can kind of invite them to come in. I use the example of social media being like the pub, the English pub place, where it's kind of the center of the community where people share stories and all that. And to me, that's my perspective of, you know, I don't do a lot of social media. I'm on Facebook all the time, but my wife is on a few of the platforms. And every time there's a decision to be made about we need a plumber or we need a painter or whatever, that's where she goes. She goes to our neighborhood page, the town that we're in, and says, who's had a good experience with an electrician? Who's got a good experience with a painter? And, you know, people will respond and say, yeah, we use this guy. He was great. Don't use this guy. He came and painted and left and was gone for 3 weeks. And, you know, we didn't see him again until he came back. Those kind of things. So that's an environment where we can get free access to let people know who we are. And again, I see sometimes I'll see churches that put a page up and they close it off. They don't want anybody except members to be able to visit their page. And that's fine if you need to do that, but also provide the opportunity for people in your community to see good things that are happening in your church as well. And so again, there's these two ideas. Again, if you're embracing these digital tools, you remember that, you know, not one way is going to serve everybody. You know, we're out past that point. So if it's digital giving, if we know that people are, you know, want ways to give with, you know, online, you know, are we making it easy for them to do with their phones? Are we making ways for people to post things with their phones? Do we give them the opportunity to do that? And remember that access is like hospitality. It's, you know, when we were all concerned about whether or not our buildings were accessible to people to come in, and we said, you know, where can we find money or grants to put ramps in, and where can we find a lift to take people from one floor to the next? That same kind of hospitality can be a part of our digital presence in places, and saying, you know, how do we make this accessible to people? If we're eventually going to be asking people to give online and to do that electronically and set that up, what's the way that can be the easiest for folks? I've been in churches where they said, oh, you can scan this QR code and you can give. And you scan the QR code, what they have is a little form pops up for you to put in your credit card information and do all these things. And this is like while you're sitting in the church pew or whatever. And so, you know, there's some problems with that. You know, it's okay for your regular members if they've already registered with that, but if you're visiting, that can be kind of a problem. There are now more and more vendors that are providing ways for people to just do that kind of giving and from one place with Apple Pay or through Android Pay or those kind of places where people can make a gift. When I had the opportunity in 2024 to go to England for the Wesley pilgrimage that Discipleship Ministry sponsors. And my wife came along with me. And one of the things that amazed us is that when we were in London primarily, but pretty much anywhere we traveled around England, every place took our credit card, but nobody would touch our credit card. People who worked in restaurants and stores or whatever, their direction was you never handle anybody else's credit card. It was a security thing for them, and everything was tap to pay. So you hold on to your card and come. If you were in a restaurant, somebody came over to you with a little machine, you tap to pay. When we were on the street, we were in the Notting Hill area. If you've ever seen the Notting Hill movie, you know, where all these street vendors are there. This is the area we were in. And you go to a street vendor and you say, do you take a credit card? Yeah. And they take out a little thing that was attached to your phone and you would tap it and they put in your phone number or email address and it would send you a receipt. And that's the way things are going. That's, I think, what we're going to find. We're going to find a system like that for churches where people can just tap and you know, give an amount or whatever, and it's going to all work. I think that's where we're heading. But again, the importance of the accessibility issue is that no one needs to be left behind. And just finding one answer and saying, this is the way we do it here may not be the right response. Is to find, you know, see what other avenues there are for people to give. You still, obviously, you don't want to tell people at this point saying, we're not going to take, you know, money in an envelope, you know, that's in the plate. We're on everybody give, you know, it's just, you have to be open to the fact that it's not going to happen all in one consistent way. I also mentioned this in the beginning. I don't want to say that, you know, carrying phones like everybody does now, we have the advantage of the fact that we have a little video camera in our pockets, which is kind of a neat thing. So we think when we're out and about at a church or an event, or, you know, we're working with a youth group and they're doing something, we have the opportunity to capture pictures and video and all those kind of things to show people what we're doing. But one of the things that I think is kind of a neat thing is if you have a youth group, the church I'm attending now is sending a youth group to a town in Tennessee that's kind of one of our poorest counties, and they're going to do some home repair work. And before they left, I made sure I said to Andy, make sure you get some good video from that. And you know what I bet? I said, I bet if you were to post something on Facebook, a picture of our kids working on somebody's house, and you said to them, because they had to do a lot of fundraising to raise the money up to do this trip. I bet if you said to folks, you know, if you'd like to support the group for being able to do this next year, you know, if you could send us a gift of $10 or whatever, that'd go a long way, or, you know, something like that. That's spontaneous giving. You know, that's like the text messages you get. I get them, you know, all day long now, you know, about supporting a particular political party, or and it's, I get people who are in races from states I've, you know, haven't been to in years. You know, somebody in South Carolina wants me to support their Senate campaign, but that's spontaneous giving. They try to get you, try to attack you, and get that emotional connection. And that's something that we really need to kind of, I think, to explore as we move ahead.
I hate to be the Debbie Downer on this, but went to an HR boot camp a little earlier, and California law about who you can post up with video, you need to have written permission. So, and particularly with youth. So it's a great idea, but you got to jump that hoop first, or you're open to big liability.
Absolutely. And actually you can, you know, you can do that in the sense of, you don't put faces on is one of the things. And like I say, so if you have kids working, you know, take a shot of their backs in the building or the place where they're working, but also with children. And I've just heard that recently, you know, people are streaming, you know, children's sermons from their church, and the kids' faces are shown. They're saying you need to shift that away too. Dave?
Yeah. So when I served a church in Tennessee that was wrestling with this concern, is there an ethical and stewardship concern about people using credit cards rather than debit cards to pay tithes or to give in that way?
Good question. Dave Ramsey, do you know the name Dave Ramsey? He does the TV radio show and all kinds of things. So Dave Ramsey's office is in Franklin, Tennessee. It's right in the Nashville area. He's a Nashville person. And he's big on credit cards being evil and all that stuff. And nobody should get rid of their, pay off your credit cards. Credit card debt is the problem, is the evil there, you know, and the idea is you're building up too much debt in your credit card. The rates are ridiculous. And so you're absolutely right. Credit card debt is an issue. I have yet to meet somebody who got themselves in credit card trouble because they gave too much to the church. You know, I have never encountered somebody who came up to me and said, you know, that preacher was so good, I just kept whipping out that credit card, and, you know, next thing I know, I can't make my payments. I don't think it's really happened. The reality is that, you know, like I say, the checks are on their way out. You know, we're changing our economy, and you know, a good point to make about that is we need to, you know, there needs to be, make sure that people's debit cards are a good way to give, which is not, you know, or, you know, and a lot of times I talk about multiple options. The bank that I use is not a local bank. I live in Nashville, but I use a bank that their only office is in San Antonio. It's USAA. And so I don't have the convenience of going into a bank office or whatever, but they will also set up an automatic payment for me to pay to my church directly and do it that way. And so that's the opportunity for a lot of folks. But again, you know, we want to remove the obstacles. If somebody is unsure how to do that, is there somebody who can kind of help them, come alongside them and say, here's how you do it. It's not hard to do, or whatever. So again, as we look at all these things, it doesn't mean we eliminate an option because somebody may not be ready to do that. We just kind of add one saying, okay, what's an easier way for a senior or for somebody who's not computer savvy to do their giving? And that's with, you know, again, and you could do a tap to pay at the church. You can do the for a long time, kiosks were the big thing, but they were pretty expensive. Mostly in the bigger churches have a little almost like an ATM in the lobby where you could go and set up your giving. So anyway, all that is again, to kind of keep open to that possibility. On the other side of that, in terms of digital presence, this is something that I really wanted to share with you. And I think it's really kind of eye-opening. And that is, this information actually comes from the Barna organization, which does a lot of work with generational giving. And look at this number. So we have 25% of the people said no, they don't research their giving first. 75% yes, and 39% of those people who said yes said the way that they research it is on the organization's website. So when you think about that, and you think about, people don't have the yellow pages anymore to look and find out about things. What are people going to do if they hear about your church? Well, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to go and Google it. And then they're going to Google it. And you can see the next one up was looking at your organization's ratings. How many people liked your Facebook page, or how many people did that kind of stuff. But this is really what I think is so key about this is so many times, I'll go and visit a church's website if I'm going to be there, or I'm going to, visit or talk with them or have a meeting with them, try to find out as much as I can about their context. And I'll look at their page, and it'll be, in the middle of Lent, and the last thing that was posted was the Christmas bulletin. It just, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for churches, especially if it's keeping things up and trying to keep it current, or again, making at least the landing page where people are going to come and visit, have the information that they need, but also be, constant in a way that it doesn't necessarily have to be changed every Monday morning that comes in, but make sure that people can access that information too. And again, I remind people, a little spot for people to give, a little corner up in the corner where if you're doing electronic giving, it would lead somebody who said, hey, that church, I remember that was a place where my grandmother's service was. It was a beautiful church, and I hope they can keep that up and keep that open. I know they don't have as many people as they used to do, but hey, I could make a gift to them. That wouldn't hurt me to do that, to open that up and make a gift. So anyway, so this is interesting. The other thing I call people's attention to, if we have clergy in the room, is that talking to a pastor or a religious leader was only 4%. So they're much more dependable on Google and our ratings on there, and what our webpage looks like, than they are about talking to any of our leaders. So what is my vision about when we have made this transition, or in the process of doing it, because the digital technology is just going to keep going and going to be more and more. Well, people keep connected. We found that with COVID. People feel more connected when they can get on the page and see what's going on, when they can find out what's happening. If there's, if they've heard there's some event going to happen at the church and they want to go check it out, what time it is, and they can find that information on the church, people feel connected. It can help us reach new people. More and more, we're hearing folks that when somebody's thinking about coming to your church, they go and check out, does a streaming service. My wife and I are in the middle of getting ready to move, and we've been already checking the churches out, the United Methodist churches in the new community, and peeking in at their stream services to see, okay, which one feels right to us, and who's doing that. We both sing in a choir now. I keep talking bad about my current church, I shouldn't mean, but our choir has drifted down. Some Sundays there's 4 of us. My wife and I and two other ladies who have been showing up. And I keep saying, you got to recruit more people or stop it. It just looks, it's just tough on us and it's tough on this. They want to see, do they have a choir? Do they have contemporary music? What are the things? You go and you find the streaming. Again, learning, sorry, I think I turned my mic off. Learning to speak to the rising generations, giving more access to folks in that way, and talking with folks, listening to saying, what it makes life, easier. What kind of things would they be looking for in a church community, and making touch points for people outside the church. Again, it's our responsibility in whatever way we reach out to people to make a case for the church's mission. So anyway, this is our next discussion question, and we're going to kind of move along. With the break and all, I kind of fell behind, but yeah. Oh, wonderful. Food, that's right. Food for the body and food for the mind. So anyway, so this is the question I want you to think about. If you want to go grab a snack or whatever, go ahead and do it. I'll make the break a little bit longer. We can let folks go into their chat rooms. Folks online, we can't, share any cookies with you, but hopefully you can scrounge for something. Yeah, we'll do about like a 7-minute break or so, whatever. And the question is, how many ways can people give in your church today, and which ones are actually used? And an important part of that too is also who's left behind. I don't know why I blanked out on. There we go. Is anyone left behind in terms of, as you think about that structure? So take a little break and stretch, and we'll be back in about 7 minutes. you want to send them into groups, and you go ahead and do that, and they can. So we're going to move into the Q&A. If you haven't been putting stuff in text, we're going to get you back into some groups, I think, if you're online. And the question was, how many ways can people give in your church? Which ones are actually used? And the kind of a side question would be, is anybody left behind? Is there any gap in people's opportunity to give?
Oh, what is it by my car or the?
That's my sound and everything. Right.
For letting me know because last night when I was sleeping, I was like, did I pick that thing?
We're going to come back in the conference center here in about 30 seconds or so. I'm going to invite folks back. The chat groups, I think, are going to maybe won't be coming back a little bit after that, but we're going to go ahead and they already came back. Okay, great. All right. So yeah, okay. Well, that's great. We are running, going to be picking up pace a little bit too. So. All righty. My watch is buzzing me, telling me it's time to get moving. Okay. So we're going to move on ahead. Any moments, any aha moments to share from that discussion? Looks like you guys were having great discussion, so I'm not going to push that because we've passed our we're in our halfway point of the presentation, but we're beyond our halfway point in terms of our time. So I'm going to try and get us back here to move. Slides are not moving forward for me. Give me a chance to. No, that's not working either. Oh. Here it is. Okay. All right. There we go. So the next section we're talking about is really kind of it's again, sort of a combination. If you haven't picked up this, I love storytelling. And to me, I think that's so crucial, not just in a life or church, but it's the kind of thing I am attracted to. I want to hear people's stories. I love to share stories that I've gathered as I've had the opportunity to travel, across the connection in the U.S. and beyond or whatever. As we get into this section, I'll share this particular story, and it's when we first got involved. Everybody remember Nothing But Nets and Imagine No Malaria, that campaign? That your churches get involved with that? Okay, I'm not going back that far. When that idea first came up, and it was the theme was Nothing But Nets. It came out of a writer in Sports Illustrated who kind of posed the idea forward. At United Methodist Communications, one of the first things they realized was when our general secretary said, we're going to help the church get on this particular project. They said, we really need to have some images that we can use as we produce material and things like that. And so they sent a group, a photographer, a videographer, and a reporter, I believe, to Angola. And in Angola, the United Methodist Conference there had a conference center, and they had a medical center right across the street. They were in very close proximity. And so they made arrangements for these folks to go and to stay at the conference center and then to be able to visit and be with the doctors and nurses who were in the medical center there in Angola. They arrived, the day they arrived, they dropped their stuff off. They went over to the medical center. And while they were there visiting, a mother came in with this little boy. His name is Dominguez. And he was suffering from malaria. And so the doctors treated him and took him to Dominguez, and they put him on this exam table, and I guess somebody put this, this garment that was there under his head so that he would, be comfortable and all. And got his exam, and he did in fact have malaria. And the folks who were there, our team from UMCOM, tried to ask the mom if they could take pictures of him, and she agreed to that. And they played with Dominguez and tried to get him to smile and to do some things, and like you do when you're around a little baby like this. And anyway, so finally the crew went back over to the conference office for the evening and settled in and went to sleep. And they got up the next morning, and the first thing they wanted to do was get back to the medical center and check on how Dominguez was doing. And this little boy had succumbed to his malaria during the night. And the staff people came back, and they told us the story, and they were devastated. And these are people who had covered, their professional reporters and videographers. They covered disasters. They had done all kinds of things, but you could tell that nothing had shaken them like the death of this little boy from a disease that was so easy to prevent, that we had pretty much eradicated in this country, but it was just so many problems that worked against it. And so I told that story at an annual conference ladies session. I was asked to speak, and I was using it as an example of how I thought that's the power of stories and how they have that, and how telling stories like that help people in their giving and grow in generosity. And I said, after hearing that story, who in this room wouldn't want to give $10 to buy a bed net? I said, I'm not asking you to do that or anything, but I just want you to see the power that hearing a story like that can have. And I went on to whatever the next point was in my presentation. And a little ways in, a guy's hand went up in the back of the room. And I had never gotten a question like that in the middle of a section or whatever. And so I called him. I said, do you have a question? He said, yeah, I have a question. He says, when do I give my $20 for bed nets? And he walked down the aisle, and it was about 500 people at the ladies session of this conference, walked down the aisle, and he said, I know there's other people in this room who want to give. And so he put his $20 down on the edge of the stage where I was on. And of course I had stopped, to answer his question, and people started coming up, and they started putting money down, and they started, and I think at the end of it, and the conference was going to take an offering for this at some point along the way, but people just came down and just put money on the debt. And so my joke that I make to pastors all over the place, and nobody has responded to it, is saying, how many of you have been interrupted in a sermon by a spontaneous offering that you didn't ask for? And I still haven't seen a hand yet come up for that. But again, it's a great story of the power, power of an image, power of a story that goes with it, how this kind of has an impact on that. And our stories our giving and our generosity, they give it meaning. And, again, even when it reflects the fact, like in this case, where people, I think, felt like, this is not something I have to worry about with my kids. This mother, this was a reality for her life and the life of people in her community. And so it almost kind of stirs up that, that gratitude of, I've been blessed to come in a country where this is not an issue. And what can I do to help help a mother? Because a mother is a mother, doesn't matter what country it's in, that experience. And so anyway, so it's a place to kind of talk about that, I think, and to begin that discussion about that way. What it also fits in with, I think, and I've kind of moved it into this particular section and talk about both these things, is what's happened to us with the offering. Because, once we moved into the area of electronic giving, a lot of the resistance to electronic giving was the idea that people didn't want to lose the offering. They said the offering was an important part of the service. That's how their children learned about generosity and how to give. It had all kinds of power with that. But what did happen, the reality happened as electronic giving became essential, really, for more and more of our church work. We also, on top of that, what we saw were passing the plate and people not putting money in it because they had given electronically, or just a few dollars or things like that happened. And that kind of made us feel uncomfortable with the offering a little bit, because here we were holding up empty plates and singing, saying a prayer and singing, praise God from whom all blessings flow. But then COVID came along and made plates really the issue then. And so nobody wanted to pass a metal plate from one hand to another during COVID. And so in all of that, that offering moment was at risk. And what I say to people all the time is, says, you know, the offering doesn't need to go away. It's been a central part of our worship experience, but it might need to change. And what it might need to be with more of its focus on is using stories to tell people about how their giving makes an impact. And one of my jobs at Discipleship Ministries is to write all the offertory prayers. And we put offertory prayers with our worship resources, but we also send them out monthly to people. And that way, in the monthly one that I send out with an email, at the beginning of every one, I write an invitation to the offering that tells a story about how people's connectional giving, because that's the stuff that's easier for me to see than local church folks. I do one that talks about where your connectional giving, your mission shares or whatever, how they're making an impact somewhere in the church. And I've been doing that for most of the years I've been doing this. And I hope that folks use that. And what I encourage them to do is to do that. They can use that one Sunday, but then talk about what their local giving is doing or what your conference giving is doing, and to find those stories as well. Telling your people about the impact that they make for the giving. That's our key thing. So the offering still has a place if we can hold on to that moment. And what I've observed when I go to church is that even if, like in the church we go now, the plates are scattered around back from the days of the COVID and all, and people, maybe 5 or 6 people in a congregation of 80 will get up and, you know, bring their money and put it in the plate. And, you know, I'm assuming the rest of the folks have figured out electronic giving. But the reality is at that moment that's what our attention is focused on. In that moment of worship, we're not listening to the sermon. We may be thinking about the doxology coming up, but that's what our focus is. And when people are focused that way, that's the opportunity to have that offering moment and to put a story in there or a challenge or something that's going to remind people that generosity is what makes good things happen, what makes lives change and how people get touched. It enables us to continue to have the offering as a worship experience. I went to an ecumenical event actually, and it was in Atlanta, and they recruited a guy who turned out to be United Methodist from Candler who taught worship. And it was a group of people who, the ecumenical group were stewardship people. And so he talked about the offering and about the changes the offering is going through. And he says, you know, the original intent of the offering was us. You know, we are the offering to God, and we've made that transition to substitute it to our, this is how we fund now. So this is our money kind of takes our place in the, in that offering process. But, in our liturgy and our history, we offer the bread, we offer the cup, we offer ourselves to God in that point. So again, this is an opportunity to keep an offering moment there and not just, to let it fade out. But I think a great way to use that is to make it, something that touches people's hearts and tells them a story and invites them into the life of generosity. And again, the offering moment, I think, is what I try to talk about. And other people, I'm not the only one kind of doing that, saying, we need to hold on to this. We need to make sure that this stays. And that at that point that we do some conversation, not just a prayer to dedicate it, but to use some of that time to invite people and tell them, you can make a difference. You can make an impact. You can touch somebody's life. So anyway, so that's what for me would be kind of like the ideal thing would be that we hold on to that moment. So my question here is, and I'm going to give you a real short time on this because I think it's like, reflect on when this giving moment has felt inspiring rather than routine. If you can think of a moment when giving the offering has felt inspiring to you. I told you the story of my experience at the lay session that I went to this annual conference, and I was just floored. I mean, I was practically crying when I saw these people bringing all this money up, and I thought, like, this is going to happen. We're going to do this. And we did. I mean, we dropped the numbers of deaths, and not just United Methodist, but the work of malaria and bed nets reduced the number of deaths from malaria by like 300%. I mean, we went from 3,000 children a day dying from malaria to about 700 over the course of that time that we did that. And I was just so moved by it. And so that's, when have you ever been moved by that opportunity to give? And my wife talks about, she talks about Tom Bickerton, Bishop Bickerton was one of the kind of the faces. Bishop Bickerton, if you don't know, he's a New York and New England bishop now. He's probably 6'8". Like Bishop Carter, he's like towers over. You see a procession of the bishops, you can see him coming because he's that tall. And he was a basketball player in college, and he came with the basketball and made the pitch at General Conference for Nothing But Nets, you know. And she remembers him, you know, like saying, you know, shooting the basket and going through and stuff, and how that was emotional for her. Get choked up talking about it. Anyway, that's the kind of thing. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as the bishop she's thinking a three-pointer, but has there been a giving moment or a kind of a one moment when you can remember that it really made an emotional impact on you? So we're just going to do a few minutes of that, share kind of briefly, because I want to try and get us back on track. We got 3 more units to cover. So, and folks at home, we can jump you into a chat, and again, about 5 or 7 minutes would probably be good and keep us on schedule. can get our online folks back, and they're coming back. Okay. So this next section, we're down. We have 3 more, 6, 7, and 8. This one is one of the ones I think is always a kind of a tough one to get over, and that is, oh, sure. I'm sorry. There's still folks are coming back. Okay, great. And I saw everybody having good conversations, and for the sake of our time situation, which we have about 30 minutes left to cover these last 3, we'll just kind of move ourselves on. And if you have good stories to share with me at the end, please come up and give, because I love to get, I'm a story junkie. So, no, we're all set to go. So okay. So where we're going to go in that time while we're waiting for that, we're going to talk about, we'll talk about talking about money. We're going to talk about property, which is a subject that I think more and more I'm really becoming more concerned about. And then finally, our last thing we're going to touch on, and fortunately I'll get that printed. So it'll be a surprise to you. Maybe a surprise to me. I don't know, but anyway, yeah, it's okay. Let's get going. So people talk about this idea about, about how do we avoid talking about money in church? How are the ways that, we don't ask enough, and so we don't receive enough? One of the things that conversations I've had with people is people saying, well, I've had people who've come up to me and said, all the church is interested in about is money. And that kind of made me afraid to talk about money, in the course of a sermon or from my time in the pulpit or whatever. And what I share with them was, early on when I was in this role in stewardship, I attended a training event at Luther Seminary in Minneapolis. And the event really got me excited because the topic was stewardship with people under 40. And all the speakers that they had, about 11 speakers over the course of these couple of days, and they each had a set time, but every one of them were people that were under 40. And they talked about how they saw generosity and how they saw giving. And in these 11 people, probably half of them quoted the same thing that they heard from people their age. And what they said was not all the church talks about is money. What they said was different than that. And it says, the only time the church talks about money is when they want me to give it. And that's a sensitivity, I think, that's important for us to think about, that there are people out there who are struggling with money, who know that money is a big part of their life, who know that it has a big influence on there, that know that it's tied to what their future is going to be, know that they're torn between things to do with it and temptations to spend it in other places. And what they're saying is, talk about money. Most of you, we all know that Jesus talked more about money in the Gospels than just about any other topic, with the exception of the kingdom of God. And what he did was he taught us how to handle money's place in our lives in a way that it didn't become a barrier to our relationship with God, that it didn't build up some kind of a wall between us and God. And I think that there's a hunger out there for us to talk about that in a way to give people, that kind of power and independence to say, here's how your money can give you more rewards than that thing that you're going to buy, from Amazon. It's going to arrive in 3 hours to your doorstep or whatever. And you're going to get it, and it's going to be fun. And it's going to make you smile, but guaranteed in about 2 weeks or just after the time when you can return it, it's going to kind of lose its shine, and you're going to find something new that attracts you. We can tell you about a way that you can give, and you can use some of the money that you have in a way that's going to give you a good feeling that's going to last longer than that. And it's that kind of teaching that is good. And I think I put this last line in here too, because just recently I've been working on a new book that's coming out about endowments and legacy giving and things like that. And I think legacy giving falls into that category too. We don't want to talk about it in churches because we don't want to talk about people dying. We don't want to go and have those conversations. But the reality is that, we all are going to die. And Jesus taught, he had lessons and parables were about people who, found all their money up and piled up their warehouses, whatever, and then lost their life. And, what good does it do? So it's all there as part of the gospel that we talk about. And so it's important. I really don't think I put this first line in. I should say this in the proper way as a question. Can we really preach the gospel and be silent on money and possessions? I started off by talking about this idea that we, for many years, in many churches, not all, but in many churches, stewardship was about, a couple of weeks in the fall, a campaign, oftentimes about bringing somebody else in to talk about people's giving, to kind of take the pastor off the hook to do that. That's one of the, there are programs that just kind of spell that out. This is a good opportunity to pastor to step back and bring somebody else in to talk about it. But how do we be faithful to the gospel with our people if we can't stand and talk about it? And in fact, I talked with a young woman. I was on a panel with a group of people and young professors about giving and how they talk about giving. And this one young woman said, I have no problem at all, talking about with my people about giving. He says, but you know what? I really let Jesus do most of the talking. I put Jesus up in the front of it, so that it's not, about me. And I saw the reality of that because I know, and having talked with pastors over the years, especially young pastors, new in the thing, is that you're in a church where so much of the budget is your compensation, your housing, your pension, your health insurance. And so it's easy to fall into that trap of thinking, I'm asking people to give money to me. And I tell the story of a new church start pastor that I was new and acquainted with and comfortable talking with, who had started this new church. And he said, I hated getting up and talking about money because I started a new church, didn't want anybody to feel pressured or anything like that. But he said, the reality is I knew that I had to be doing that. We weren't going to make it out of the school unless I could talk about this comfortably. And he said, one day, an older woman in the congregation, he was a young guy, and an older woman in the congregation took him aside and said, I know why you have a problem talking about money. I said, because you think it's money given to you. You think that you're the main expense in this new church start, but you need to get over that. You need to get by that. This money is not going to you. You get a salary because whatever pastor would be here or start this would get a salary. And you just need to get that out of your mind and worry about what you're spending money on and what people in the congregation are seeing. And you need to talk to us about money because we're never going to get anywhere if you can't do that. And Jacob, bless his heart, he said that was a turning point for him. And he said, I can talk about this now. I can use the gospel and do that. Again, you're asking for the mission of the church and not for you. This quote on the bottom here is one of my favorite Lovett Weems quotes. And this is the book that it comes from. I've got sneak a little picture in there for you if you want to find it. But this is something that I think I've been talking about in all the years I've been doing, but I've never heard it said so succinctly to this. In fact, I asked my wife, and we kind of dropped we missed the opportunity to do it. But I said I almost would love her to make me a sandwich sign so I could put these two things on me and wear them all day on this trip. But here are the principles, and listen to these carefully. They're so simple, but I think they're so powerful. Principle one is we never talk about people's money apart from their discipleship. That's a secret. That's the key. We're not talking about their money. We're talking about their discipleship. And that's the context in which we talk to people about it. And the second principle is we never talk about the church's money apart from its mission. So we don't talk about, we need people to give because the budget is low or this or that. We talk about we talk about money to what we have in the church or what we want to do with our money. We talk about it directed to our mission. And so my thought in my mind is, what if a church finance committee committed to actually physically do that? Not just say, yeah, that's a nice phrase. That's a clever quote. It's part of it. What if we really did that? What if we all said, whatever the group that gathered around that finance table said, what if we committed to ourselves? We were going to hold each other accountable that we get up anytime we talk with people about money, we're talking about their money. We're going to talk about their discipleship. We're talking about the church's money. We're going to talk about it. We're going to make sure that we're talking about the mission of the church. And would that change the culture? Would that help with our constant struggle of our scarcity? There's not enough all the time. if we began to talk to people about it in that way. I think that can kind of help us kind of move the ball a little bit. That, and again, looking for ourselves at those passages where Jesus talks about money and says, you know, here's what Jesus says about, storing up treasure for ourselves. Here's what Jesus says about the work we do and, how God sees the work we do, and use those teachings to help us get more into that thing about talking about money. And again, I go back to what I said is, people want us to hear about talking about money, not just about the money they give. They want us to tell us, how do we live better, more faithfully, more joyfully with the money we keep? That's what I hear when I keep repeating that phrase to people. The only time the church wants to talk to me about money is when they want to give. A lot of the stewardship programs that come out, whatever, oftentimes they'll have a little study guide that goes with it. And, what I say to folks when they want to look at one of those for using it in their annual campaign, and I don't have a problem with annual campaigns. I really don't. But that doesn't encompass all the church needs to do around stewardship. And then they'll say, but there's a study, Adam Hamilton's, what's the name of it now? It's not on my mind. Adam Hamilton wrote a great one about Enough. It's called, very simply, it's called Enough. And it has a great study guide to go with about, our need, what is enough in terms of what we have. And I said to people, that's great, but you know what? I said, in my opinion, just my opinion, if you do it while you're in the middle of the campaign, it's going to seem like we're helping people, make decisions about their money so they'll give more and kind of lose. I said, put it before you do the campaign. Do it as a Lenten study. Get that in people's mind. That helps you kind of bring the stewardship, theme of money and caring up at different times in the church. But it has more authenticity when you're doing it, I think, at a time when that pledge card is not the finish line. That's not the end point of that. And again, that's just in my opinion about that. So again, what's the vision for this? What does it look like when we've embraced this well? Again, we're talking more about it. We're inviting others to do a generous life. We're not apologizing for it. And again, we're letting Jesus do the talking if that's the way to get ourselves into it. David and I were talking about it, and I threw this line in there about, because I really believe that oftentimes I talk with pastors who are saying, we're trying to tithe, but it's really a struggle on what we have and or our kids need and all that stuff. And I said, I believe working toward a tithe is a great way to go. It's a great benchmark for that or whatever. I said, but you know what? One of the things that might help you is do one thing extraordinarily, something that's kind of beyond what you thought you might be able to do. And it kind of takes you to a new level of generosity, and it will give you a really good feeling, and you'll be able to talk about it better because you've experienced that. And what you're doing then is inviting people into that joy. And so I shared in the other program too, and I'll share it real briefly with you, is that, my wife and I decided that, I had this passion for Africa University. And I said, I want to put Africa University in my will. This is going back probably 20 years ago, 15 at least. And so I said, I'm going to include Africa University in my will. And one of the points when we were in between churches and doing some shopping or whatever, our tithe was kind of building up in our tithe account. And so I said, we put Africa University in our will, but we didn't really have any money to start that off. So let's, we can give them $1,000. For us and what we were making. That was a pretty good gift, and they bust over us or whatever. We started the account with that. Before we died, we said, want to have some of it there. And we did that a couple more times when we had, our tithe fund kind of caught up, and we say, make another gift. And so, I think now like they've invested it, and I mean, it's been over a period of years. It's about $25,000 now. And like I say, they're still going to be in the will or whatever. Well, that was an extraordinary step for us to do that. It just happened because we weren't, we didn't want to go into a church and drop our whole tithe at a church that we didn't know if we were going to stay at, that they would saw us and feel, well, we lost those people, whatever. So, it was time when we had built that up. We said, let's do something with that. That's kind of, and it felt great. It was such a joy to do that. And we keep talking now because we're going to be church shopping, and we're kind of saying, what can we do before we have to start giving all of our tithes to the church? So let's go out. Let's be one of those people who go like to the grocery store and pay the grocery bill for the people behind us, that kind of thing. That's the kind of joy that we're looking for to do with it. I mean, our giving to the church brings us joy too. I don't mean to say that, but anyway, so that's the vision of what it does. I think, I said this to Martin. I think I said, my dad used to say this, and I still remembered. He said, you know, people say you should give until it hurts. He said, if you give until it hurts, he said, you probably need to give a little more until it feels good. You know, that's the idea is not to give until it hurts. If you're giving till it hurts, probably need to go a little farther and give until it feels good to you. And so that's, again, kind of the attitude I try to present to that. And again, present giving, future giving, legacy giving, whatever it is that's going to bring you joy. You know that someday there's some student who's going to struggle to get into Africa University, but they're going to get a scholarship that's going to have Bridget and my name on it, you know, and they won't know who we are, and there'll be nobody to write a note to or whatever. But we know that that's coming. You know, we'll feel like that's coming, and it's a great feeling. So discussion for 6 is, how comfortable are your leaders talking about money? And I'm talking just about pastors on the thing, but you know, how are we feeling? How your people in the pew feel about when we talk about money? And what's the feeling for that? So okay, so let's take we're getting really late. Let's do 3 minutes on this one, folks, because I got 2 more to touch on. I have to tell you, I'm behind, but I'm not as behind as I was 2 days ago. So. About another minute and a half, so make sure everybody gets a chance to say something. All right, thank you. You guys are all, you did good timing here. We're going to come on back. What was that? Oh, good. All right, whatever buys you off, I'm all for that. Yeah. And you can call back our chat people coming back, or oh, great, they are with the program here. Yeah, take a minute to come back. I will tell you now before we move off of the talking about money thing. Pastor who I grew up with had this line, and I remember him saying it, sitting in church and making him say it. I thought it was so good. And he's 92 now. he's had a great long life. But he got up, I remember getting up one Sunday, he said, I have some good news and some bad news. He said, the good news is we have some places where we're short on our mission expenses, and it doesn't look like, unless we get more giving, he said that we're going to be able to do that. He said, the good news is the money's in your pockets. And it got a laugh, but like there's a truth to that, it really was kind of, and our last section, I'm going to have to move through pretty quickly, but it's about the scarcity mentality.
Yeah. And we need to add that into this. Yeah.
So that's going to be, that's a biggie, I think. And the next one I want to move on to that I think is also kind of something that's becoming more and more a current thing that I'm seeing in the church that we need to talk about and build into. So this is the idea around property, and how our property assets really should be serving our mission. And I think, it's a new way to look at our buildings and stuff. And what I'm hearing more and more as we have come through the pandemic, and churches have, had people who didn't come back from pandemic either because of illness or death, or people just got out of the practice of going to church. We all went through, I think most churches went through some drops in numbers as we tried to come back from that. As we went through disaffiliation, where, some people left and some people were sad that churches didn't disaffiliate or did or whatever. So we've been through all these experiences, and now we really find ourselves in situations where we're struggling. And a big part of that is where we are with property. And again, if you're in a situation, I talked with a pastor at the first meeting we had 2 years ago, and he said, our church was burned in the wildfires. He said, what happened after that is we got the insurance money, and the building that we're now in now, or that we're building, it's much more in tune of who we are as a church right now. And I think what's probably happening in places that have not had that experience, but are in buildings that are really not the buildings to take care of the ministry that they need to do right now. And it doesn't mean that I advocate for people selling off their churches or whatever, but I really think there needs to be a change of attitude and approach to buildings that we see. These are assets that we have for ministry. And, I told the story I went to the South Carolina conference last year. I set up my table on a Saturday before the conference started. I set up my table in the area where the display tables were going to be an annual conference. And next to me was a table they were setting up, and it was a new church start called Open Hearts United Methodist Church. Love the name, all that stuff, talked to them a little bit and all that. Saturday night, I went back to my hotel and I said, Sunday morning, I don't have to I'm pretty well set up, and conference doesn't start till after lunch. I'm going to go find a church and look up the Open Hearts United Methodist Church. And I thought they were a new church. They might be in a school or something, whatever. I get there, it's this lovely church that they're in, good parking and all that stuff. I walked into that church. I've never been greeted by as many people and treated as well walking into a church as I did. They were fabulous. Had a great worship service, good spirit. Pastor came up and talked to me and all that. It was just a wonderful church. And I talked to people after church, and I found out that that church had been struggling. That building that was owned by a congregation, and there was another big church in that community in Greenville that had decided to disaffiliate. It was a close vote, and the people who wanted to stay United Methodist when they deaffiliated were looking for a church to go to, and this church had a nice facility, and so they came together, and it made this fabulous new church start. And they had all the facilities, and the people who were struggling were like, people coming in, whatever. And I was just so struck by the difference that every place I had been in my ministry, and I served in smaller churches, there was that fear we're going to die. We're going to die. If we merge, it just puts off our dying. It was that whole hospice kind of mentality. And I said, there's a different feeling in this. There's a feeling of, we can do so much, now that we have more people, we have committed people, we got this group of people came in who loved their church and loved the denomination, and now they put new life into it. And so I think it kind of is going to, I hope that will change the view of how we look at the fact that sometimes we may need to consolidate churches together in a positive way to be able to do more work in mission. I'm not saying it's every situation, but I think it's so important. Article just came out from the news service, if you get the United Methodist News Service, about two churches that, not through any coercion from the conference or the district superintendent, started talking to each other and saying, we're hanging on, but we're struggling, and we're really struggling with this, and we've got the property insurance went up, and this is going up. And somebody said, well, why don't we all come together, and we can, either one of the churches could hold both congregations now, and we'll sell one of the buildings off, and we'll have some assets. We can do some things. But right now, we can't do anything because we just don't have the resources to do it. And not only did they do that, and they celebrated coming together, they decided which building they wanted to sell off, and they sold it off, and nobody died over that. This is a battle. When they got the money from the sale of the church, they said, you know what, this is really nice if we got all this money, but is there a church around that maybe we could take part of this and we could help them out? And there was an ethnic church in that community that was struggling as well, but they had a different cultural kind of service or whatever, and they just said, we're going to make a gift to the United Methodist Church, give them a little help. I mean, I was ready to cry over it. I was just like, it's such a different thing. So I don't say that to say run out and close your church, or run out, you have to merge or whatever, but I think it reflects a mindset of coming through all the stuff we've been through now. We knew in COVID, we thought maybe that, that would kill the church. We could be church without the building. We kept it going. We did the streaming. We had Bible studies online. We did people, interacting. I told the story of my sister's church. They wanted to stream the service during COVID, but people said, can we open up the Zoom like 20 minutes early so we can all get on and talk to each other, because we missed the time in the narthex. So they would say narthex times is the 20 minutes before worship, and they just turned it on. You could do chaos. You try to talk, figure out, get heard by somebody else or whatever, find out how Sarah's doing or this one's doing or whatever. It's a new approach. I think it's an opportunity to have a new approach to property and assets. Again, right sizing our buildings. People talk about we have to get rid of staff or whatever. Look at our buildings and saying, is there some way we can right size what we have to meet the ministry that we do today? And I put this line up here, and probably this is a little dramatic, but the question is, do your buildings take the food from the mouths of your missions? Again, the congregation my wife and I are attending and doing the stewardship work for, they had their insurance canceled. I didn't know. I don't know what the trustees do, whatever, but they were putting in every claim. Every time something broke, they were putting in an insurance claim, and they canceled their insurance. They had like 8 days to renew it, and they raised their premiums like 400% or something like that, like $85,000 a year for property insurance. And it was like a crisis, and they were like, oh, where are we going to get this money, whatever. And I'm like, maybe it's telling us something about how much building we have. And they did. They had a sanctuary that had the capacity of about 400 people, I think, and we have about 80 people at each the two worship services. But anyway, it's those kind of questions we need to be kind of asking and looking and saying, is this really right for the ministry that we have today in the community? So again, what are the ideas of this? Well, to understand, I think basically that, property is not neutral. It's either working for you or it's working against you. And again, I'm not going to say, I don't know what your situations are. I'll say it again, you're the context experts, but it's a good question to ask people. Is our building working against the ministry we're called to do, or is it working in favor of that? And one of the answers to that is to utilize your buildings more. If you're only using your buildings once a week, then you may come up with one answer. If you can find ways to, again, share that building space and make some more impact on your community by doing that, again, it can expand the ministry that you do. There can be new possibilities of things that you do. Buildings that are used a lot attract more people. If your building has people going in and cars parked in front of it every day, people are going to look at that and say, that's a church that's doing some things. They're going beyond just taking care of themselves. They're doing that. Underused buildings rob mission and ministry. That's just money you have to pay and to keep the heat on and do all that stuff. And, again, there could be other things, other ministry opportunities you could be doing with that. So my recommendation is that we move beyond the point of thinking about every time we think about our situations in the buildings, it feels like death. And what I say is assess your assets for survival. What's the best way for the ministry to survive at this church? what's the best way for it to go on? Again, imagine partnerships, another congregation, could be a congregation of a different, from a different denomination that needs some space to meet. We have some amazing creative solutions that people are looking at. So look at what the possibilities are. Align your property with your purpose. Make sure that, whatever you see your purpose in that church, in that community, make sure that property aligns with it. The challenge is to grow your ministry to fill your building. If you say this building is no way we'll ever let go of this building until the, last person gets put in the ground, well then say, grow your ministry then to fill that building so that makes it then part of your mission. And again, consider what goes on in your community might be an unmet need. To me, that's what, as a healthy church approaching this, this question of property and assets that we have. And again, maybe it's a building sale that, that the property is worth enough that investing that and the assets of that would allow ministry to continue, maybe in a smaller facility, maybe in a rented facility, maybe in something, it's at a place in your community that doesn't have the big steeple, but it's really the core where people are. So I think we're going to have to look creatively at that stuff. So this question number 7 is, how well do your buildings match your current mission? Again, where are properties underused, or how could they be used to expand your ministry, or secondary questions, but take a few minutes to do that one. I've gone past my time, and I'm going to touch on the last one when you come back. So again, I'll give you about 3 minutes to talk about it. I hate to give you that little, how about 5 minutes to talk about it? And let's send the people into their small groups, and then I'll do the closing one, and we probably won't do much of a discussion around that. one more minute, make sure everybody's had a chance to say something. All righty. So folks online back from their group, so they come back. They're back. They're coming back. Okay. Okay. Well, that's good. That's good. Is there something to they're telling me that? Hello. What was that? Hey, Gerald. I don't know if you can see or not. I don't know. I don't even know if they can see me. Oh, there you go. There you go. Okay. So the last section that I want to talk about, and like I said, I really feel like the property issue is one that is just something that where it's going to be more and more kind of present in a lot of situations. But again, I'm very encouraged by what I see as the response to it. It's just a very different response from what I remember having been on conference staff. And, David, we had a lot of little churches that were struggled, right? And he kind of held on and resisted. I served the place where I served a new church plant was in a community that had originally had 4 United Methodist churches in it, in a growing community, and only one of the 4 churches had indoor plumbing. Now, you picture people moving into suburban communities and, oh, there's an outhouse, working outhouse in one of the churches. And then the other church didn't have, the district superintendent wouldn't come because she said, I need to go to a church where I know if I have to go to the bathroom, I can. So anyway, but that's, like I say, it's just, it was all kind of struggling. And we'd say, hey, they gave them the opportunity. You could all come together and we could work on this new church start together. And everybody said, well, we'll do that if you close your buildings and come to our building, whatever. And then finally, one of the churches, before I started the new church, one of the churches closed, and they had about 6 people who were coming regularly, and they came to help me start the new church, which was a wonderful gift. And the other churches kind of kept going on their own, kind of sputtering, and eventually one of those couldn't continue, and they closed, and some people came and used that asset. So again, it was just very much such a kind of a hospice sort of environment. I am just so happy to see those encouraging things. Fits right into this idea of how we get ourselves stuck in the scarcity mentality. And I know that it's real, a financial situation, real in many places, but we have to remember that it's a question of where we are in our finances. It's not a question of God. God is not a God of scarcity. God is a God of abundance. And I also say, used this phrase in places, and some people have pushed back to me and said, how about God is a God of sufficiency? Because the word abundance sometimes carries meaning for folks that it's, that you're going to get, like the prosperity gospel, you're going to get abundance poured down upon you, whatever. And sufficiency, I can see that too. But the reality is that God will open a way for us. There's enough. Our problem is we get stuck in that mentality, and we were saying, we just can't do anything. And we know that, again, if you've ever had the experience of traveling internationally, I've had the honor of worshiping with congregations in 4 or 5 different countries in Africa. And David and I actually were talking about it. David and I did a trip together to Beijing and Korea. And so we saw big churches, we saw little churches. In Africa, we saw, churches that were met under a straw covering, whatever. People did their offering with joy, danced the offering up and left vegetables and things like that in their offering. So, again, if we come back and think, we're getting in a scarcity mentality in this country. But it's, I think the danger in this is we can become fixated. I use the term, I make sure I was using it correctly, but myopia, it's a spiritual myopia where all we can see is what we don't have. And so I think we have to look at where we're making an impact. We have to see the things that we're doing. And I think we have to get ourselves beyond that point of saying, that we can't do this. We can't do everything. You have a smaller membership, you can't do everything, but you can do some things that really make a difference. and that work against that spirit of saying scarcity, of saying we just have to hold on tight to the little bit we have left and not share it, and move things along that way. That we're just a small church, response is what I often hear from people. We can't do this, we can't do that, we're just a small church. Well, the Methodist movement was a movement of small groups, right? Isn't that what Wesley's vision was? We these small churches. I don't think Wesley's vision was that we were going to be a network of mega churches. This was a movement of people getting together in these kind of groups and being accountable to one another and these relationships. And look, they changed the world. They changed the history in terms of in that time. It's not just our financial resources, it's our human resources. We look at that and we say, well, our financial resources could be better, but we have great people who are committed to mission. They have good hearts and whatever. And again, it's not necessarily in this case about that your financial situation has to change radically, but our perception of it. Because the problem is we feel like we can't do. We don't have enough. We can't do anything. And there's lots that we can do. We don't have financial resources, expertise, or time to do more. This is one of the things I encounter a lot in my work because I'm very strict when people ask me the question about having a separate treasurer and a financial secretary. And I say, you have to have it. The discipline says it. There's no wiggle room for that. If you have a person who is coming in and knows how to use your computer and you want to give them both jobs, you shouldn't do that. You're asking for trouble, maybe the most trustworthy person in the world, but there's a reason why this is in the discipline and it's very strict. I said, and if you can't come up with two people to do it, maybe there's another church you can talk to and maybe you can kind of share those responsibilities and, put those things together, get some help in that way, but there's just have to be flexible about it. And, it's just kind of like, it's easy to kind of come up with that way of that mentality and say, well, yeah, that's a good rule, but we can't do it because we're a small church. And, I think, like I said, we just have to say, well, look for new opportunities, look for something. One of the things I said to folks, I said, even if you're a small church, when you do your budget, you should put something in your budget for new ministries. There's just something about doing that, that says we're going to put some money here. When somebody comes up with an idea or dream of what we might do, we have a little money put in the budget, in the budget that we could try something. So again, it may not be thousands of dollars, it may be hundreds of dollars, to put in the budget, but it's that opportunity of saying, we're not done yet. We're going to have some new ideas, or we're going to hear something that other churches are doing and say, hey, we could do that if we had a little bit of money to get it started. And I just think that helps kind of shape the mentality and move us beyond that. I think dreams are so important. In a course I wrote a while back about generous church leadership, I asked the people the question, if you had somebody come up to you at the way out of church and they said to you, if I gave this church $50,000, what would you do with it? That was my question in the course. And I think it was $50,000 or $100,000. I can't remember. But I can't, and of course the course was designed for clergy, but I got so many answers from people saying, well, I go to the council and we'd form a committee and we'd start to brainstorm some ideas about what we might do and how we might use that money. And my comment back to them would be, it'd really be good if somebody came up to you to donate that, if you had a dream in mind of what you might do with that. Because if somebody comes to you and they put that question to you, and it happened to a pastor that I know who was in New York City, and somebody came up to him and on the way out of church and said, if I gave you $50,000, what would you do with it? And he said, I would buy 60 seconds of time on a New York City all news channel in the middle of the day, and I would do a moment of kind of a reflective moment in that time, in a very kind of in a generic way, but to kind of uplift people in the midst of their daily time. And the guy said, "That's great. I'll write the check tomorrow." But he had a dream. He had an idea. Now that's not the dream that anybody else has got or whatever, but he had an idea of saying, "What would you do?" I also have a story about a pastor who called me up from Virginia, and I got on the phone with him. I'd never met him before, and he introduced himself to me, and he said, "I need some help." I said, "Glad you called me." And I said, he said, "Well, I just got a call from a lawyer in town that the church has been left a bequest of $14 million. And he said, I don't know what to do next. And I just wrote an article about this. And I said, well, you are smart, because what you do next is really important. And, his fear was that if I tell people that we got this gift, nobody's going to feel like they have to do anything again, that we have got money to, whatever. And so, of course, being a good person that I am, David, I told him, I said, have you talked to your foundation yet? They can help you with this. And, but really what I wound up saying, he said, I'm not really ready to even talk to the foundation. He said, I need to talk to somebody maybe who's been in a similar situation. And so I connected him with a good friend of mine, Joe Park, who works at Horizon Stewardship, and they do a lot of great work. But he had been a banker before, and he kind of knew. And I said, Joe will know, how that gift can be used positively, or how it might be kind of the death knell for people getting involved in your church, and he'd be a good one to give you advice on. I've never had that experience, unfortunately, but he would be a good one to do it. So again, it's that idea of, where we have a dream, what would we do? How can we utilize that in a way that wouldn't disrupt the support and the ownership that people in our church feel? Because I also knew a pastor who got assigned to a church that had gotten a big endowment, and people didn't want to do anything. Their Sunday school dried up, and nobody wanted to volunteer, because they said, well, we really don't need to get more families in, because we've got the endowment and it's paying our way or whatever. So in that case, it was destroying that church. It was tearing apart the fabric of it. So again, having a dream, I think, is a good. Asking the question would be, if we were asking ourselves the question, what would Jesus want us to do? And if we started our finance team meetings, and I've said this for years, if you started your finance team meeting not with what are our problems or what are the bills we can't pay, but we started it by saying, where have we seen God's blessing in our lives? And made everybody go around the room and say something to that. That was how we started every meeting. How would that change the dynamics of our thing? What are the needs in our community? What could we help with the resources we have now? And who might be excited about supporting this new idea? One of the things we learn about with donors is we have conversations with donors, not necessarily to give what we want to give, but to find out where their passions are. Here is somebody, like I say, I talk about, this decision we made about African University. My passion was education. I think that's the best way we can help people, is to give more people access to education. My wife, her passion, if she were going to make a donation, would be to feeding programs, because she's been through some times in her life where she's really struggled to keep the family fed and things like that. And so, that's what our passions are. So when we did our African University scholarship, we talked about this, and I said, how about if we made it a scholarship for the agricultural school at African University? So it'll do education and help feed people. So again, finding out maybe there's somebody in your church who's got an excitement in a particular area and would get on board and would find some extra support to help you move in a new way. So anyway, so that's what I want to finish. I'm sorry I've run so far over. The last question really, and you can kind of ponder this, I guess. Does your church still dream of new ministries? And if so, which one would get you most excited? Find some time to kind of have that conversation in your church. Find a thing. What are the dreams? We put aside the financial report or whatever. What are the dreams, or what do we see in this community that we would like to be able to do? And just hold on to that dream and say, maybe if we really kind of focus on that dream, maybe there's some people who would dig a little deeper or whatever. There's people give for our offerings out of their income pocket most of the time, whether it's their retirement income or their working income. There's also an asset pocket. We know this when you do a building campaign or whatever, people are giving your regular giving, and you ask them to give more. And oftentimes that money comes from, assets that they've accumulated. The thing, I didn't mention it here, but came up in the other session, we have people now who are getting in retirement age in their 70s, and myself breaking into that club. We have IRAs, and we have to start taking money out of those IRAs. There's a provision now. If you take that money out, you put it in and you were able to deduct it from your taxes. There's a provision now that if you give it directly from the people who are holding your IRA to the church, you don't have to pay any tax on it. You can't claim it as a deduction, but you don't have to pay the tax on it. So if you wanted to say pay off, somebody in your church wanted to pay their pledge forward, give the church $10,000 out of their IRA. If they do it directly, it's called a qualified charitable distribution. If they give it directly from that institution to the church, not to their bank account, but to the church, they don't have to pay tax on it. So a $10,000 gift, if they took the money out, they paid $2,000 in tax. If they used it to pay their pledge, it would only be $8,000. It could be $10,000 by doing it directly. So again, you may find somebody surprising and saying, you know what, I'm still giving regularly to the church, but I was thinking about taking my IRA money and doing that qualified distribution thing and doing something really different with it. There you have it. Maybe somebody, that's the thing that's going to get them excited. So anyway, thank you for your time. I'm sorry that I went long. It probably is no comfort to you that I was worse 2 days ago in terms of going over